Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Open Mind, a lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders at the intersection of science and culture for relevant and meaningful discussions about mental health issues. This series is proudly brought to you by the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and it is my honor and privilege to introduce our featured speaker for today's program, renowned award-winning and best-selling author, Mona Simpson, who is here to talk about her latest masterful and engrossing novel, Commitment, the story of a single mother's collapse and the fate of her family after she enters the California State Mental Institution for Treatment for Mental Illness in the 1970s. It is a story about one family trying to navigate a mental health crisis that many have experienced firsthand in their own families or in those of their friends and neighbors. Mona Simpson is also the best-selling author of Anywhere But Here, The Lost Father, A Regular Guy, Off Keck Road, My Hollywood, and Casebook. Off Keck Road was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award and won the Heartland Prize from the Chicago Tribune. Mona has received a Whiting Writers Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Writers Award, and an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She is on the faculty at UCLA and also teaches at Bard College. In 2020, she was named publisher of the Paris Review. She lives in Santa Monica, California, and as it turns out, just a block away from where I live, and she walks her golden doodle right where I walk our golden doodle. Nice coincidence. We are also honored to have with us Dr. Elizabeth Bromley, who will join Mona Simpson in conversation. Dr. Bromley is professor in residence in the departments of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences and anthropology. She is a board-certified psychiatrist, medical anthropologist, and health science researcher. She received her MD and MA in the history of medicine from UCSF and her Ph.D. in anthropology from UCLA. She is a graduate of the VA-UCLA Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program. Dr. Bromley's clinical and health services research focuses on severe mental illness and partnered implementation in community settings. She has a particular interest in clinician emotional experience and in clinical and research ethics relevant to the community mental health context. Now, just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask either of our speakers a question, please type it into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We have a lot of people registered for today's program, over 800, so we will do our very best to get to as many questions as possible, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Today's program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. There you will also find a calendar of upcoming events, an extensive library of videos from past Open Mind programs, information about our Friends Research Scholar Program that supports early career neuroscientists, the Open Mind Film Festival, and our new Teen Advisory Council. And now, without further ado, please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Mona Simpson and Dr. Elizabeth Bromley. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much, Vicki. Thanks for welcoming us. Mona, it's very nice to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I really wanted to just begin by thanking you for this book, which is a very special book, a very warm book, lovely book. So thank you for writing it.
I appreciate that. Thank you for reading it.
You're very welcome. I thought it might be nice for us to just begin with an open question for you about why this book, why you were interested in writing this book in particular.
Well, I'm sure it's always hard to tell. I mean, I'm sure most writers probably write books for reasons they don't even understand, and I would include myself in that. But I think a few things I was thinking of in particular with this book were, I've taught for a long time now, and there's something about the seeming equality of college that's all I always find very moving, because you come to UCLA and kids come from all over the state, all over the country, but a lot of kids from California, they're all in an identical dorm room. They eat the same food in the cafeteria. They choose from the same roster of classes. And yet they come with such a different load of experiences and such different things they're contending with. I found that just as a teacher here that, my students are sort of seemingly the same, and yet then one will be driving a jalopy, into UCLA from far away, and it will break down on the freeway and he can't come to class that day. And I was thinking of a student in particular. I came up with this character who goes to college, but is dealing with a real family crisis at home. So I was thinking of that in particular. And then as I went on, while I was already writing this book, I read an essay, a wonderful essay I came upon by the great neurologist, Dr. Oliver Sacks, whom I'm sure a lot of you have read. And it was a beautiful and, to me, very surprising essay called The Lost Virtues of the Asylum. It was actually written, I think, as an introduction to a book of photographs of all these abandoned American asylums for the mentally ill, insane asylums they used to be called. And it was a really surprising essay for me, because I'd grown up, like a lot of us had, I think, in the sort of post one flew the cuckoo's nest generation, who sort of assumed that a state mental health hospital was a snake pit, and that it was a kind of prison, and that the conditions were terrible, and that was something that patients needed to be freed from. And his essay, he'd worked at Bronx State Hospital for I think, between 2 or 3 decades, and he wrote about his experiences there in an almost elegiac, nostalgic way. He remembered a lot of patients walking peaceably, reading a book. He remembered patients in the libraries. He remembered a patient orchestra which practiced. And he also he sort of traced the history of how these institutions started in America and what had become of them, and also cited a lot of memoirs by people who'd actually been in mental health hospitals and felt safer, felt secured, felt they were able to have a meaningful life there. So I guess that's what I was thinking of. And I think it struck me so deeply because I had a mother who I think struggled with mental illness. It's hard to know exactly what's mental illness and what's not, but she struggled very seriously with some delusions, with some voices, things like that. And she managed well. She had a meaningful career. She helped stroke victims learn to talk again. But reading this essay and doing the research I subsequently did, I found myself wondering if there might have been an easier, gentler life for her possible.
There is something, yeah, thank you for that. There's something gentle, home-like about the portrait you allow of the asylum that Diane, the mother, stays in. There are friends there. There are activities. There are the flower arrangements that she works hard on. There's community and family from the doctors and the nurses and their children who are a part of that community. It's a side of things, a side of that world of the quote unquote asylum that we don't normally get to see. That is one thing about an asylum. It's far away. It's outside of our usual commute or day-to-day intentionally, right? So it's sort of lovely to see that portrait of it. At the same time, you set the novel in the 70s, beginning in the mid-70s in California, at a time when that institution is clearly on the decline. That's a piece of the story, a little bit of the story, but not the central piece of the story. She still can enjoy it, can benefit from it. So, I'm just curious about this institution in that particular decade within California and what seemed right to you about that.
I wanted to sort of enter at the last moment where one could have had that kind of experience. I mean, I think the emptying out really started, I suppose, with President Kennedy signing the Mental Health Act of 1963, which was the last legislation that he signed before his assassination. And he had envisioned these large state mental health hospitals closing and all kinds of community hospitals opening to fill their places. And the way things are, once the legislation was passed through the Congress, it was passed in the form of block grants, which meant that states had a choice of what to spend that money on, and many elected not to spend it on these facilities. So less than half of the envisioned replacement facilities were ever opened. So I wanted it to be sort of the last moment of that institutional vision that we had for a large part of the last century, and that dwindled, and not even only mental health hospitals. I mean, I remember growing up with an orphanage in the center of town, and we don't have that anymore. Now we have an elaborate different system of foster care and so forth. So of course it's interesting for us now, I think, to look at what was before, and of course we hope for progress, but that's not always the case. You're in a much better position than I am to comment as to whether people are better cared for now that all these institutions have closed. I know it's impossible to generalize, but what do you think? Do you think it's been a good thing?
It's such a challenging question. To me, there's no doubt something has been lost. And I too remember reading that Oliver Sacks essay and being struck by that vision of something gone, that really it's difficult to imagine it being rebuilt in that same way. A setting that is intentionally a community, a place where there's some productive activities, there's an understanding that people don't need to leave, and maybe not even an emphasis on getting well and exiting. It feels today like all of our institutions, even mental health caring institutions, they're so oriented around making people leave. And I it's hard to say how accurate that sentiment is in Dr. Sacks' essay, but I can imagine that was just much less pronounced. The continual focus on getting better so that you go did not feel like a piece of that asylum that he describes. And it's good and bad, right? I do think there's something lost. I think we've replaced it with some smaller institutions that can be equally supportive, nurturing, communal. But we won't have something like that again. And I think what's so moving for me about the book is seeing how that particular kind of institution, that hospital is also a home, a place for the kid's mother to be while they went elsewhere and grew up and lived their lives. She was ever present for them, for Walter and Lena and Donnie, even when they were across the country. They were hyper aware of her situation there in the hospital. At the same time, they knew where she was. They didn't have to worry about her well-being, that she was being taken care of. They weren't scared for her there in that institution. And that balance the tension that all of her kids seem to experience in the book about fears of being away, and at the same time knowing she was okay and how to handle that. Very formative for all of them. And so I don't know, it would be good to talk a bit about how you understand the asylum in relation to their formative years, and also how you imagine it would be different today had you set the novel in the present and where their mother would be today, which would be different.
Well, as I did research for the book, it was really interesting doing the research too. A lot of people who are suffering with this kind of mental illness today seem to have a kind of there seems to be a bit of a rotating door, so that they will be committed. You know, when they have a really bad episode, they will enter some sort of a hospital. They'll be there for a short time. They'll be stabilized and they'll be out again. But sort of long term, there aren't so many intermediary. There aren't really places for them to get some help, but not total. And the facilities themselves are becoming more and more forensic. In other words, they're being used more and more for people who have been convicted of a crime or who are awaiting trial for a crime. And so the whole nature and the whole sense of the place is different. It feels less like a hospital and more like a jail. And then, of course, there are all those statistics that most mentally ill people who are in an institution now are actually in a jail, you know, so that's not good either. I wanted to write, I mean, I did want to write about, you know, the family as well, and sort of what happened to them. And I know that it's a hugely hard thing to have a family member it's very hard to love someone who's suffering from this kind of illness. And one of the characters in the book says at one point that though she knows the line about, you know, she tells her friends, well, what if you're it's just as if my mom had cancer. It's the same thing. It's an illness like any other, but it's an illness that does sort of affect people's their emotional responses. So it feels as if it changes their ability to connect and to love. And so, you know, from her perspective, it's something that really infects love in a way. And so another thing I wanted to get to a little bit in this book was, while the kids are, you know, the three kids are, one is in college, one is in high school, and one is even starts out in middle school. And so there's a lot of tension, you know, even just on the most material level of, will they be able to keep the rented place that they're living in, because their mom is no longer, you know, after a while, she's no longer receiving checks from her employer. For a while she gets disability from them, but after a while she doesn't. And another thing that was important to me in this book is kind of the role that non-familial friendship can play in our lives too. So much is made of the nuclear family, and in this case it was actually a friend of the mother's. The mother had a very close friend. They were one of those friendships that might not have been entirely equal. You know, I think the mom was a little bit more colorful and exciting, and her friend Julie was a follower to some extent. They worked together. They're both nurses. They worked together for years and talked and been friends. And Julie relied on her friend Diane for color, for adventure, for boldness. And now that her friend really fell into this terrible depression, Julie stepped up and really helped these kids manage their lives, helped the two younger ones stay in where they were living. She helped them out financially for a while, and she had to be there because they had a boarder. The mom had taken a boarder to help with money, and you know, the boarder could have potentially called social services. They could have been taken away. So Julie stayed there even when a social worker showed up, and finally ended up having them move to her apartment. But so it was about that too, to some extent, sort of the unheralded in literature, but nonetheless really significant role in life of friends.
Yeah, no, the friends and the kindness of strangers to me is so striking in the book as well. And it goes back to an issue you brought up at the very beginning about how much is happening for young people that is very private and often invisible, unknown, even sometimes to close friends. And there is, of course, in the book, a lot of debate for the kids about what to share about their mother, how to share the story of their mother with new people that they meet. And so it demonstrates both the tension of needing to keep things private, and then also just unbidden, sometimes in very surprising ways, people they don't know well who end up able to help in one way or another, or do something really critical. And I think for me, it really captured what happens for young people in that transition out of the home into their own independent life, that there are people who fall into your path, do something that perhaps for them didn't feel momentous, but for you, for that young person, makes all the difference. And so I just love the way the love of the mother for her kids may be impacted by the illness, but it still runs between all of them, keeps them all knitted together. You must think about that when you see, as we all do in LA, people on the streets who seem so alone, and yet they're someone's parent or sibling or child, and yet they seem so isolated. How did that kind of classic contemporary LA reality play into this book?
I think that was very big. I remember I spent a fall in New York and I came back to LA, and New York City is hardly paradisal in that way. But I came back to LA that winter, and it was around the holidays, and the shopping centers were full, and yet I just overnight the tents had built up on San Vicente and everywhere, really. I would walk the dog at night and see people who were clearly hadn't been homeless for a long time. They clearly were working but were sleeping in their cars. I mean, it really reached a point. It feels to me just incrementally a little better. You would know better than I would if that's actually true, if the new mayor's program is working. But how do you deal with the mentally ill people who don't have services right now, who aren't getting the services and the help they need?
Right. I think what's so troubling in thinking about long stay hospitals, those institutions that really have gone away, and really we've been living without them for enough decades now. We are sort of creating a level of psychopathology on the streets that is astounding to me, that I just haven't seen in any other setting. And it's because, of course, experiencing homelessness is extremely traumatic, and it makes people ill physically, mentally, very, very destabilizing for the strongest of people. So anyone with a disability that plays any part in them losing housing, losing relationships, and then suddenly having to live on the streets, very, very traumatizing. So, we see people who have lost real basic functions and ability, not just to grocery shop or cook or buy clothes for themselves, but even the ability to bathe or shower any longer because they've been on the streets for decades. And for people with severe psychotic illnesses, there's a comfort in withdrawal sometimes for some people of being a little more alone. And at times that can be because internal thoughts can be very, very stimulating. And so having a place that's a little more quiet, or a place that is quite loud, like under the freeway or on a very, very busy street where there's a lot of almost white noise, gray noise that sort of quiets out some of the internal conversation. These are places where people can sometimes hide, sometimes be trying very hard to keep to themselves, to keep away, to keep silent. So, boy, it takes a long time both to find an individual like that who may be most hidden, most suffering, most distressed as a result of some symptoms or a severe mental illness, to find them, to be able to find them again the next day or in the next week when you want to come back and talk again, and to find a way to, without being alarming or intrusive, to bring something that's of value, and then slowly to see if there's a way to open into a dialogue about something that might be safer and might be preferred as safer. And it entails trying to come to an understanding of what feels dangerous or distressing or unpleasant for the individual from their own point of view. And it can be very different from what we might assume from the outside. And so somehow finding a way to open up a line of communication.
So
I do think, just to say one thing that I find very helpful, is imagining that individual in a family, thinking about imagining a family of origin or a set of people around that individual is very helpful.
And I'm sure even outside, people do form, families of friends and just survival. I've in this novel, these kids really do. Their mother having fallen into this illness really does determine their lives, and it's a big deal. But as you point out, nonetheless, they weren't, after she was stabilized in the hospital, it was largely grief over the life that she wouldn't have. It wasn't that they were worried about her physical safety that minute. And I just wonder also what it does to all of us, in your estimation as an anthropologist and as a doctor, what it does to all of us to see this level of despair among us, that we know, we as a city, as citizens, as people who live here and as neighbors are not offering sufficient care and safety and no real pathway as of right now for so many people to a dignified and decent life. What does that do to all of us?
Well, you've answered your own question in a way. It does a lot to us, right? It is a thing that we can't forget about, that we're confronted with in ways that we can't control, that we find very distressing. Yeah, I think to me, there's no question. It's very corrosive for all of us to live in a context where we know there needs to be an entity that can be helping us support our neighbors, that it's beyond what we as individuals or even as united neighbors, what we can do for ourselves. We need others to help us ensure others can be safe. No question, it's corrosive. And I think for some people, it's easy to become callous. It can be dehumanizing because it's much easier to imagine that, oh, this person must deserve this, or they must have done something to warrant this kind of treatment. I don't think any of us really believe that rationally if we begin to think about it. And yet it's hard to manage the emotional load of seeing people clearly in distress and not being taken care of. It has always been with us. I mean, I do think this is an important moment because it's not different that there are people who need support and help. It just has been historically in the past the case that those would be people who might be in an asylum and not seen by us, who would be away. And of course, we also need to keep in mind how many people are in jail or incarcerated in settings where we don't have to see them. So it's very important to recognize that the things that we're seeing are only indications of a vast amount of need for support and care that's going unmet, that's out of our vision. But I think, yeah, no, I think it is just so painful to think about. It makes it very easy not to think about it. And I think that's what we have to guard against, is allowing people to acknowledge, recognize the emotional distress of those kinds of scenes.
I did a lot of research at Metropolitan State Hospital in Norwalk, and it was very interesting. I talked to a lot of providers, a lot of doctors, a lot of nurses, and especially it was interesting to talk to some of the women some of the people who actually worked there in the 70s. There were 3 nurses I got sort of close to who actually are now they're older and they're long retired, but they still are volunteering their time just to put together the archives of the hospital. And they talked about patients who, even though the hospital is becoming more and more forensic, it still is it still is a state hospital. And she talked about people who would actually go out for a little while but find life outside too. There aren't programs that are helping them reintegrate. There's not a family, perhaps. There's no way for them to really gain a foothold. So a lot of the patients would sort of come back in because they would then go and maybe go to a restaurant and not pay the bill, do some petty crime, so they would be sent back to the hospital where at least they would have the basic needs met, with food and a roof over their head and warmth and a shower and basic human needs.
Yeah, I do think there's always a risk we have to keep in mind of when we have opportunities for people to be committed, to be sent to a hospital, maybe without their involvement or against their will. There is a real risk to that. And so I think, one thing very important we have put in place since the 70s, for sure, since the the LPS Act, is a set of guidelines, and it requires us all, particularly professionals, to reflect and debate whether an individual should be encouraged to be in a more inclusive, community-based setting, whether they're ready for more risk. And so I think that tension is just inherent. There's no right, simple answer to this. As you say, trying to leave and take on more responsibility is terrific. And if it means the individual stays out of that context, that's good. If it means they need to come back and they recognize why, that's still fine. So I think these safeguards are really very important. I just think it was very moving to see a family so close to the present, but not in the present, where they could not worry about this. They weren't worried that the Dr. Moss was going to call them and say, oh, your mother's a lot better. Let's have her go move out, right? And it did allow the kids in the novel to explore their own needs, to feel a little bit of distance, which of course we all need, enough distance, feel their mother was still safe, right? I thought that was just a beautiful portrait of that time. And it would be nice to return to that sort of safety for families, to have services that can help families to feel that sense of calm.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes even when, I know that there was and earlier this year, there were a couple of subway crimes that were at least mentally ill people were accused of them. Whether they actually committed them hasn't been determined. But, our politicians are saying there should be more, it should be easier to commit someone. And yet it's almost a ridiculous argument at this point, because we don't even have the beds. We don't have the facilities. And so we're a long way from offering really anything to a mentally ill person right now in distress.
True.
And things have, I think it's important to say also, mental illness has always been with us, but I do think our social system has really frayed. at least in my lifetime, I've seen that. I've seen what we as communities are able to offer, what we're willing to offer. The marginal tax base in the 70s and 80s was much larger. I mean, we seem to be willing to spend much less money, many fewer resources on public safety nets of all kinds. And I think we're all feeling the toll of that.
Mona, is there something you were deeply surprised by in your research on mental health services in order to write this book? What surprised you?
I was deeply surprised by, like, for example, just in this particular hospital where I spent a lot of time, in the early days, the hospital itself, and it was sort of wild. I mean, they were considering several sites when they built the Metropolitan Hospital. It ended up in Norwalk because it was the best train route to bring people in. But Beverly Hills was another one of the locales that almost had the big state hospital there. And the hospital for many years, I mean, of these 3 retired nurses, some of the nurses they'd worked with, their parents, it was almost like a company town in the sense that their parents had worked there. And the hospital, and one nurse went there right after high school. She started working as an aide, and then the hospital paid for her to go and get her nursing degree later on. And she worked there all her life. A lot of people they had at the time, they had also housing for some of the people who were, the psych aides and the nurses. Some of them lived on campus, so to speak. So and the doctors' houses were right there within, right there in the hospital. So it was a community in a more real way than I imagined it. It's not like the doctors are driving in from the suburbs. It's not, or now perhaps, but it wasn't like that in very recent history. So I found that really interesting and surprising.
I feel today we have those kind of generational employment around prisons. There's some towns, right, rural towns, where prisons are the business that unfortunately have so much nicer to have.
I mean, we have so many prisons and so many private prisons, and yeah, that's considered a little bit in the book too. One of the oldest son is interested in architecture, but then when his mother enters this institution, he becomes fascinated by the history of sort of institutional architecture and how the early founders of psychiatry thought that the place itself would offer certain conducive aspects to healing. And he became interested in institutional architecture. And later on, one of his old friends from school comes to him with a proposition. He's working for one of these corporations where there's only 3 or 4 corporations that build all the private prisons. And he at first considers it because, for one thing, it's an opportunity for a whole lot of money. But then he looks into their model, and there's just no way that he can make it good, because their whole model relies on more prisoners, less help, less classes. No, I mean, it's really just surveillance.
He has a compass, he has a wisdom. In that moment, he's able to make the right decision about not getting involved in this kind of an endeavor. And there's sorrow in that too. His grief about his mother is a piece of him being wise enough to walk away from that. But it's moving to see that people have choices to make in these situations of what they want to invest in or not. I didn't know if you wanted to speak a bit about Middlemarch, which is a book that is in a way threaded throughout this novel, and so many themes remind me of it. What would you?
About a lot, because I'm doing a summer reading of sort of a couple. I'm right now doing 1 chapter a week, but we'll ratchet up to a few more chapters a week. A kind of slow reading of Middlemarch over the summer for a little literary magazine called Book Post. If anyone is interested, I think it's free. Anyway, but in Middlemarch, there's one of the Middlemarch is a great, it's a book that Virginia Woolf said is one of the only great novels that's truly written for adults. Because it's so full of mistakes and errors and idealism gone wrong and all kinds of things. But one of the things that's interesting about that book in relationship to what we're talking about is there's a very idealistic doctor in the book who dreams of creating a fever hospital that he thinks would be very, that fever was the big problem in the 1830s when the novel was set. And he has these dreams, but his personal life, you know, it's a wonderful novel plot because he doesn't really get to create his fever hospital, in part because of whom he decides to marry, which of course is always one of the great subjects of the novel.
And that doctor falls in love with medicine over a picture of a heart and the valves of the heart. So I was very struck by his fascination with the mechanics of the body. And it does sort of speak to this issue. His downfall in a way was that he couldn't quite get relationships to make sense and to work for him. He did have a somewhat mechanistic idea of people, which of course is a thing we still contend with, our wish that people would be machines or could be fixed. And these are ideas that are too simple to fit into human nature.
It's one of those great books in which the two great characters whom you sort of hope will fall in love never do. But end up being friends in a significant way.
And having nonetheless a community and a very vibrant everyday life full of meaning and connection, despite mistakes and failures and idealism that doesn't pan out and so forth. They still are connected. So that to me is reflected, mirrored in commitment as well, that kind of connection.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I wanted that, but you never know if it comes across.
You never know. No, I saw that too, and I think as well. There's wish for progress is a kind of preoccupation that children have about their lives, and will they achieve the things that they dream of, and they do and they don't, and they make it work, and that just felt so true to life. Lovely in that way.
Would you talk about your work a little bit?
Yeah, which part of it?
And how the anthropology intersects with the medicine.
Sure. Yeah, I think in medicine I was always so interested in understanding why things were organized the way that they were. Why do we have particular disciplines, specialties in medicine that deal with this problem and not this problem? Why do we call it this? Why do we learn in this way? Why are our institutions structured the way that they are? And I mean, that for me at the very beginning.
Were you a doctor first and then became an anthropologist, or vice versa?
Yes, I went to medical school first, and then I took a year away from medical school and I read a master's degree in the history of medicine. And I had no intention of doing anything more with it. I just needed a break and I wanted to read. And again, I felt like I did not understand how we got to this point, why medicine looked the way it did. So I did that in the middle of medical school, and then I finished my medical training. And then after I did my residency in psychiatry, and I knew I might want to try doing some research, I just found I was most interested in these kinds of fundamental questions. What are the concepts that we're using to structure our care? What are the reasons that providers, physicians behave the way that they do in relation to patients? How does that match what patients experience of their own health and their own illness? And those are anthropological questions.
Oh, great. That's such
Thank
a
you for asking.
beautiful combination.
So Thank you both so much, Mona, for writing this very important and unforgettable novel that has so much relevance for today, and the situations that are so prevalent today, and that we see on our streets, sadly, and in the jails. Elizabeth, thank you for sharing your vast knowledge, and you certainly have so much with a medical degree and an anthropology degree, and we're very grateful to you both for joining this open mind presentation. We do have quite a few questions, so I'd like to move on to those now. We have several questions about when the state institutions closed, what was the Reagan era. And a lot is blamed on that time. And I know it started with Kennedy signing that act, but then the states could individually do what they wanted. But I thought that, and I sit on the board of the Resnick Hospital, and this discussion has come up, that there were supposed to be community centers as the safety nets when those state institutions were closed. And what happened? Why did those?
Well, the money was allotted in the form of block grants. And as one of the doctors at Metropolitan said, you know, they had the choice. They were given this money and they could spend it on highways or on mental health. And many of them chose highways.
Which people are living under now.
Another thing happened too, which is a large part of the early institutional movement in the United States was taken from Europe and was taken. There was a program of treatment, you know, before the big miracle drugs, so-called of the 60s and 70s, which was called moral treatment, and relied a lot on sort of patients spending time in nature with music and conversation, a sort of slower, more wholesome life. But the fact of the matter is that involved, so a lot of these hospitals were also working farms. They would have their own gardens and patients would work in the gardens. They would milk the cows, etc. And then there was a law that actually prohibited patients from, you know, I'm sure the law was well intended. I'm sure it was to try and prevent exploitation, you know, of the patients. But now they can't necessarily do that kind of work without compensation. So the whole economic model also fell apart for many of these hospitals.
Thank you, Mona. Beth, did you want to add anything to that?
What I do think, yeah, that absolutely. I think the other piece that is easy to forget is that the federal government really withdrew from support for housing in the 80s. It's the other thing that happened during the Reagan years that has persisted, and it just has meant that we have housing that's much less accessible. So we're all aware of this challenge. Housing in LA is, of course, unaffordable. It's also really inaccessible. It's very, very hard to stay organized enough to keep oneself housed in a setting where housing is scarce and very, very expensive. You need to be able to work very consistently at a very high level, and you need to be extremely organized in accessing housing. And so when the federal government pulled out of housing, we end up with less housing, and housing that is a higher barrier to entry. And, you know, I think there's no question that homelessness is caused by housing unaffordability. Fundamentally, that's all it is. Housing is too scarce and expensive. For those folks with any functional challenges, which may be due to mental illness, maybe due to physical illness, it's no surprise that they will find it difficult to access housing. So, you know, the whole care network of boarding cares and other kinds of group homes that were supposed to emerge around deinstitutionalization also struggled because they were in a context where housing was becoming more and more expensive to maintain.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you, I know, Beth, Elizabeth, you are a street psychiatrist, one of your many hats that you wear. Can you talk a little bit about what you find when you go on the streets and talk with people that are living on the street?
Yeah, I think homelessness is not one problem, and there's an enormous amount of variety, right? Many, many, many different kinds of stories that you might find among people experiencing homelessness. It is rare and it's unusual to find someone where there's a feeling that the severity of their psychotic symptoms, for instance, is fundamentally a barrier to accessing housing. You find it, but it is unusual in the sense that it's a minority of the problem. For the most part, folks who are experiencing homelessness have fallen on hard times, have been through a circumstance of violence or divorce or loss of employment, loss of family, a migration experience, minor incarceration jail visit that then results in losing an apartment, minor events that become very difficult to dig oneself out of. So there's just a lot of variety. And I think we see from the data that what works best for most people is brief rental support, just a quick intervention to bring someone back inside and allow someone some time to organize and get back on their feet. That does the trick. It's the unusual group where we really do need to think about treatment as being a piece of the process of moving inside and moving indoors. And that's very painstaking work. That takes a lot of trust building, a lot of time, and a lot of multidisciplinary work to move someone off the street and toward safety, along with some treatment.
Thank you. We have a question here about, are there any government options for mentally ill homeless?
So let's see so make sure I answer the question in the way it's intended. What is the government doing in a way now to address homelessness among people with a mental illness? We've made a lot of progress in LA in the last 5-6 years, moving well-resourced treatment teams to the streets. So there's much more happening in terms of not just physicians, but social workers, peers who've had lived experience of homelessness, being available on the street, doing outreach, but also doing outreach that leads toward housing. And I do think it's the case in the last 6 months, much more has come online and is available in terms of short-term hotels, interim housing that can lead to something more permanent. And I think we see it at the state level as well, that there's a huge commitment, new commitment to mental health services, not only for people experiencing homelessness, but for kids and adolescents as well, particularly around stresses of COVID that we all recognize have been severe. So I think we really are seeing an all hands on deck focus on ensuring people have the basics that they need to experience well-being. That really, if you're outdoors, it's not possible to reach a state of comfort and calm and peace. And so we need to provide the basics. I think we really are going to begin to see in the next interval some real progress in that vein. Obviously, challenging problems, difficult, hard to be optimistic in this sort of context. But I think we're all much more aware of what needs to happen. We have much more data about what's needed. So I do sometimes feel cautiously optimistic.
Good.
Thank you. Well, with dedicated professionals like you, it does give us hope that people really care and are trying to solve the situation. And yet, both Mona and I live right across the street from Ocean Avenue Park, and it's still, you see many very sad situations, people living in the park and with no basic needs met. But that's to give us hope.
Kitchen that's right there. The line is just, it's around the block every evening.
There's another question here about health insurance coverage and how some of the residential care and facilities is completely dependent on one's health insurance coverage or not. and also for addiction recovery as an inpatient. I know there are a lot of private addiction centers where they are very expensive and insurance does not pay, but are there any where the health insurance
There are,
kicks in?
fortunately. I mean, I think there are a number of private, but there's also a lot of, I mean, Orange County is full of recovery centers, and a number of them are full service and do take insurance.
And do you have any idea how much is covered? Because
I think
mental health parity is a big issue these
no,
days.
quite a bit. I'm thinking of one I visited that there were a number of longshoremen and longshoremen's kids, because their insurance was the place they found because it covered most of it. You know, and there weren't a lot of frills. It wasn't a Malibu rehab center, but it seemed to be very effective.
I know
I would-
UCLA is taking some Medi-Cal now for psychiatry patients, which is UCLA Health has fought very hard to be able to do that, which is.
Have things changed also since COVID? Because so many young people now have had mental health challenges and need help since the disruption of the lockdown.
Well,
Yeah, no,
go ahead.
Oh, no, I do think it's a tough time now. I think COVID did strain the resources for kids and adolescents, and it is one of those areas where we know for publicly insured kids, it's very, very challenging to access high quality mental health care. You know, I will say, I think public mental health systems in LA frequently offer exceptional care, do a terrific job for individuals with a severe mental illness, and regardless of their insurance, publicly insured, uninsured, the quality can be very, very good, particularly around some of the more severe illnesses. But I think we do see that divide and that disparity, particularly for children with fewer resources, that good mental health care is very hard to access. And worse than it was before the pandemic.
Not surprising.
So, we have one question here asking for the name of the Oliver Sacks essay that you both mentioned.
It was called The Lost Virtues of the Asylum. And it was used as an introduction to a book called Asylum of photographs, and it was also published, and it's available online at the New York Review of Books.
Thank you. Let's see. Well, we are actually out of time, but I do want to just throw this one question out. So, were we better off in the 70s than we are now?
What do you think?
I think maybe. I mean, I think it's almost a useless question, because I don't think we can go back to that. But I mean, I think in some, you know, and it is so particular, I'm sure in some hospitals, for some people, they did have an option that is not there now. On the other hand, I'm sure there are also some small private treatment centers or some small public treatment centers that are good now. It's just too much up to luck. We'd like it to be a little more, we'd like to have more consistent offerings, I think.
Elizabeth?
I completely agree. I think that's the best answer there is. It's too precarious. It's too unpredictable. We've terrific treatments now that were not available then. I mean, just more understanding of how to use treatments and medications. I mean, there have been advances. I think we're much more attentive to issues like autonomy and recovery, ensuring that people have meaning in their lives, not just that they're taking their medication. So clearly those things are better. And so settings that can provide a basic level of support and care are doing a wonderful job. So we just need more of them.
We definitely do. Thank you both so much. This was a fascinating conversation, and I think everybody that was on this Zoom learned so much from both of you. So thank you everybody for the privilege of your time. We are going to be off for the summer, but the Open Mind series will resume again in the fall on Tuesday, September 13th. Our guest will be Dr. Alyssa Appel, who's the author of The Stress Prescription, 7 Days to More Joy and Ease. And she'll be joined in conversation by Dr. Emran Mayer, distinguished research professor in the Department of Medicine at UCLA and the executive director of the G. Oppenheimer Center for the Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience at UCLA. With that, I wish you all a wonderful summer. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you back in the fall.